My name is Katie Hoskins, and I'm the Research and Instruction Librarian at California Health Sciences University. Today's webinar is about poster design tips. And this is part of a series organized by librarians at osteopathic medical schools to help you advance your research skills and support your scholarly activities. We welcome students, faculty, clinicians, librarians, anyone who thinks that they might be able to benefit. The hope is that by the end of this webinar, you're going to be able to describe visual elements like typography and colors that you should consider when creating a poster. But before I delve into this topic a little bit, I'm going to do a short poll here, and because I'd like to hear more about who's actually here in the audience today. So if you could please take a moment to complete this, I would appreciate it. Okay, so a lot of librarians, welcome, a good number of students. So glad to have all of you here today. I hope this will be helpful for everyone. So like I said, let's get into it. Why does poster design matter? Shouldn't it just be about our science or whatever it is that we're trying to share? Well, I wish that it was only about the science, but it is also about how it's designed, because it's human nature to make split-second judgments about how things look and do we engage, do we not engage? And if you recall any experiences you may have had in a poster hall, and you're going by, sometimes there are literally thousands of posters. So you want something that's visually appealing and that isn't going to obscure your message, because you also want to make sure people will come in and that they can then understand as well. So some of the visual elements that I'm going to talk about today include color, typography, words, tables, graphs, photographs, and layout. What I'm going to cover today barely scratches the surface of these different concepts. There's a lot more to be learned as well as applied, but I hope that this will be able to help get you started. So let's talk about color. Color is amazing because it can do things like highlight conclusions about data or emphasize specific data. And it's also really good at conveying information faster than words alone. Well, I kind of got a little bit ahead of myself. Some good things that are important to know about colors, because we have to be careful about it too, is you want to use warm colors in the foreground. So when you think about warm colors, if it helps, think of fire. So yellow, orange, red, those are your warm colors. Like in this case, you can see some peaches and some pinks in the foreground. And the background are your cooler colors like blues and greens and some purples. And supposedly it's because as we evolved, we've always been attracted to warmer colors in the foreground. So think of like fruit on a tree, that's a warmer color, and then the background, like the trees and the leaves, are darker colors. Whatever the reason, that's why there's the recommendation to go with warmer colors in the foreground. Another good recommendation and strategy is to limit your use of an accent color. So in this example here, orange is the accent color. The eye is really attracted to accent colors, like a bright orange and especially, or reds, those types of things. So you want to be careful about when and where you put it on your poster, because the eye is naturally going to be drawn there. One design rule that I have heard about before, not that you necessarily have to follow it, is 60-30-10, where your dominant color you use 60% of the time. So in this case, white. And then your secondary color is about 30% of the time, and then your accent color about 10% of the time. This poster here, which I'm the person that did it, so I'm happy to share it, it didn't quite follow that, but I still at least tried to use that accent color sparingly. That's the main principle of that. It's also really important to think about the contrast between your colored elements, whether it's text or graphics. So this example is from a poster. So the heading is in a light blue, and then the font is in white. And what I did is I went to WebAIM, their contrast checker, and I put in the hex code for the foreground color of white, and I put in the hex code for the background color of that light blue. And then WebAIM told me, nope, this does not pass our accessibility standards for readability. And this is really important for even somebody that doesn't have visual disabilities, because every computer screen resolution is slightly different. And so that is going to be a factor. But then if someone does have visual disabilities, if there isn't sufficient contrast, they're going to have a harder time or not even be able to read it at all. So that's why it's really important to think about this. And it can be helpful too, even if you're trying to print in grayscale or black and white, which not everybody's able to print in color. it can also help with that to ensure the readability. When you're thinking about color, if you're not limited to institutional colors and you're trying to figure out, well, what colors do I put on my poster to try and have a cohesive theme, you can use a color wheel. And Canva has a great color wheel because you can put in one color and then tell it what kind of color scheme you want, like monochromatic or complementary, and then it'll spit out some other colors for you to use with their hex codes. So these are 3 common color schemes. The one on the left is monochromatic. So they're all shades of green. And that suggests that they have, they're part of a larger uniform category and that it helps create this consistent, unified look. The one in the middle is complementary because those colors are on the opposite side of the color wheel, but they help complement one another. But this also draws attention to the differences in the data, that these are different. And that's what we're wanting to highlight there when you use those types of colors. The last one is what we would call analogous. So those are adjacent to each other. So red, orange, and yellow are right next to each other on the color wheel. And so that suggests that they're related, right? That they're closely connected. And so that example that I happened to do had to do with things that increased risk for an adverse health condition. And that's why I think that they chose those different colors as well. So that wraps up color. If you could please put your question into the chat, I will be glad to answer that at the end. So now we're going to talk a little bit about typography. Typography, and your choice thereof, as this says here, affects the legibility, meaning, and the tone of your presentation. Each font has its own personality. It has different sizes. And so you want to be really careful about what you do. Like this one on the second line, I think it's called Chiller. And so that might suggest more of a mystery kind of thing. Not that I think anybody would necessarily use that for a poster. I just wanted to help illustrate some of these differences that fonts have. And also make sure that you remember to check, how do the numbers look too? Because it's not just the font itself. Sometimes like the numbers are like below the line. So you want to make sure you check that too when you're considering a font. In general, the recommendation is that you choose a sans serif font. Sans serif, meaning that it is without the little feet at the end of the letters. And that's recommended because they're easier to read from a distance. If you think of a big box store like Walmart or other stores like that, their signs in the store are generally with sans serif fonts. There's also some evidence that sans serif fonts are easier for people to read that have a visual disability like dyslexia, because the feet aren't there to interfere with the spacing of the letters. So the sans serif fonts are Calibri, Arial, Helvetica. There's a whole bunch more, but those are some of the most common. Another aspect of typography is the casing. So all uppercase, which I think most of us would probably say that's like yelling. Then there's the title case, which is where, the first letter of all of your main words are capitalized, but as you'll notice in this example, and isn't and of isn't. Then there's sentence case, where just like a sentence, it's the first word of the sentence that's capitalized, but nothing else, unless of course you had a proper noun. And then there's lowercase, where everything is lowercase. In general, title case is recommended for not only the title of your poster, but your major headings, and then to use sentence casing for your subheadings and your figure titles. So this is just kind of an example of how, whether you use bolding or underlining, italices, the type of fonts that you use, that some of them are more legible than others. So someone had a question when they registered about the general recommended font size. It's hard to recommend a specific size because, as you can see here on the left, the text height is not equivalent to the point size. These are all in the same size of, let's just say 20, but as you can see, they have different heights based on the font that it is. So that's why you're really going to have to take a look at it. I recommend trying to put it on a bigger projector and viewing it at 100%, and then being able to then kind of gauge its size. On the right are just some general suggestions, like their title being an 85 point. Sometimes I found that that's too large, especially if you have a longer title. The main thing is, again, trying to ensure readability, especially from a distance. Now let's talk about words. I think we have all seen posters where there are these large blocks of text, right? And it looks really dense and it's not really readable or inviting. So it's important to be concise, and bullets can help with the readability as well, especially with spacing between paragraphs, but you also want to make sure not to put a paragraph with a bullet in front of it. So trying to be as concise as possible. And sometimes that's where it can also help to have a colleague or a friend review it and give you some suggestions on that. Another suggestion here with words is knowing when to spell out a number versus using the numerals. And that can vary from style or field. So just make your best judgment on that one. Another consideration with words is which verb tense do you use for where, because it's not the same across your entire poster, or if you're doing a paper, that either. So in the background and the introduction, generally present tense is used. This helps to suggest acceptance of previous findings. For your methods and your results, that's the past tense because you performed these things in the past and these were the results. Then the conclusion is present tense to help place your findings in the context of what's been written. Another thing that can trip some people up is commonly misused or incorrect words. Like irregardless, I did not know, I think until after I got out of high school, that that's not actually a word. Then there's things like on the right that are similar, but they're different. Affect versus effect. Those are commonly mixed up words that mean different things and are used in different ways. And there's a lot of resources online and print books as well that can help describe the difference between those commonly used words and when to use them. So now I'm going to talk about tables. And tables are useful when you have a lot of data that's either too detailed or too complicated to be provided in a block of text. I mean, look at this one here, and this comes from the book Designing Science Presentations. It's really hard to tell, but buried in here are three different things: the minimum average monthly temperatures for Seattle, the maximum average monthly temperatures, and the average monthly rainfall. So it's hard to tell that by looking at this block of text. And the other part that's difficult is we can't really go and pinpoint one piece of data. Like if I wanted to know information about September, because I'm thinking about visiting Seattle in that month, it's really a lot harder to pull that information out. But if it's put into a table form, oh, well, then it's clear to see this is the data that they are presenting, as well as easy to then go pick it out by the month. Or even if I wanted to look at by minimum temperature, I could go pick that out a lot easier. So there's a lot that goes into a table. So if that's something you want to learn more about, I could either do a follow-up session about that alone, or I would encourage you to look at the book Designing Science Presentations. I do not get any money or kickback for this. I just found that it's an excellent book that goes over a lot of these great concepts and explains them very easily and clearly. And that goes over like the alignment of numbers and text in a table, doing grid lines, how people read, because we read in columns versus rows. So there's a lot of important things to consider there when doing tables. So another element that's often on posters are graphs, and these are useful to visually communicate patterns, trends, or relationships among data. And the example that I have here is about coronavirus paper topics. So this is a line graph, and so their timeline goes from January 2020 through November 2020, and the different lines represent different topics. So at the start of the pandemic, obviously the main concern was modeling it and controlling the spread. That's the bright orange line. And then the light blue line at the bottom is mental health. But then by the time we get near the end of their timeline, the modeling and the controlling spread's the least written about thing, and mental health is the most. So this is showing the trend as well as that relationship. So that can be really helpful to have on your poster. But not all of the graphs are created equal, and you really need to think about what are you trying to show. And that's where the data visualization catalog can be really helpful. I mean, the book does go over it too, but the data visualization catalog is free. And you can search by function, like comparisons or distributions, hierarchy. This is a screenshot from relationships. So do you want to show connections? Do you want to show correlations? And depending upon what you're trying to show, depends on the type of graph that might be best. And I've used this resource myself. I was trying to show disparities by race and ethnicity for a certain health condition. And the numbers alone weren't really helpful in conveying the depth of those disparities, but creating something where the boxes were proportionately sized for those was really helpful in better illustrating those differences. So this is why you want to really think about that. So then there are photographs. As I'm sure we've all seen posters where things can become, they're blurry and they're hard to read. I was just looking at a poster recently, and even at 100%, you couldn't even read any of the text. So in general, for pictures, you want to aim for at least 300 pixels per inch or dots per inch. As you can see on this graphic, when the fewer dots per inch or pixels per inch, the more blurry and pixelated with all the boxes that it looks. There are also vector images, and I could go into a little bit more about that. They're based on mathematical equations, not pixels. But the main thing to know about vector images is that they can be resized without losing quality, because that's something that's pretty common when you have pictures and other graphics, is that you can lose quality when you resize them, especially if you're trying to blow them up for a poster. Okay. And there's a lot of different places where you can get images that are high quality or icons too. So you can search for those. We also have another webinar, Scholarly Snippets one, that already covered about how to find reusable images. Because another piece of this is making sure that you have permission to reuse any images that you find. So even if it doesn't have the little copyright symbol in front of it, it is copyrighted. So just trying to be sure that you try and use images that have a Creative Commons license or that you think you could justify fair use for. So trying to be mindful of that. And if you do use photographs, it's very important that you protect the person's identity. So this one I took from a poster with a case report. And that one is particularly important when you have a case report, that you're trying to protect the identity of the individual. So especially if something wrong on the face, really minimizing how much of the face is being shown and blocking the parts that aren't necessary for the clinical presentation. And then, of course, ethically modifying images. There's a bunch of different considerations there. So the last thing that I wanted to briefly cover was layout of a poster. So on the left is what people a lot of times call the traditional poster. So I would look at it with the title across the top and then the columns with the content. On the right is the modern poster, which I have sometimes also seen referred to as the billboard poster or poster 2.0. There are criticisms for both layouts and styles. I hope that a lot of these principles will just at least help to better design whichever layout you choose. And this also goes to a question that somebody submitted, but I think is really helpful regardless. And that's, how do you get all of your elements to line up? Because the human eye is really amazing and can tell when something's off even just a smidge. So Microsoft PowerPoint, which is what I generally use for posters, but you can use Google Slides, has tools to help you to arrange objects. And that includes your text boxes and your images. So sometimes I group my objects. So if there's technically two pieces, I can group it so it becomes one, which can help when I'm organizing things. There's also the option to align them. So you can align them top, middle, or bottom. So across a horizontal axis or a vertical axis. You can also distribute them so they're equally spaced. And again, that can be horizontally or vertically. So those are some really helpful tools when you're actually trying to get everything lined up. As for what sections are actually on the poster, a lot of times you have your background or your introduction that kind of helps to provide the context for your study or your project. If you do have sources that are cited, this is generally where they're going to be, at least for the in-text citations. There is your hypothesis and/or your objectives. Sometimes people put that in their background section. And if you do, the main thing is you just want to make sure that that doesn't get lost in the rest of your poster in that section. There's your methods. So what did you do? And this isn't extensive, like the minutia of everything you did. It's just the key highlights of what you did. Then you'll have your results. There's your conclusions, references if you have any, and these are generally pretty small. You don't want those to take up a lot of space. And your acknowledgements. Your acknowledgements can be people that helped you. It can be sources of funding, IRB approval if you needed it, or even if it was exempt. So a lot of those different things that go on there. You also want to make sure it's not just the elements, but they're in a logical order, because people read down in columns. And so sometimes I've seen different posters where they put the conclusions in the left column with the introduction, and then had all the other stuff over to the other side, and it just wasn't a logical order. The things you do not see on the poster are the abstract. That's something that you are submitting to the conference organizers to consider when your proposal, as well as what will appear in the program later. The other thing that generally does not appear on the poster is the discussion, because you're generally doing that while talking with people. Someone also asked about what about a poster for a case report, which is an excellent question as well. And that's something that's similar in a lot of ways. Like with this example, we can see that it looks a lot like the traditional poster would. There's still that background section. There's the purpose, which is essentially the objectives. There's the case description. They have a timeline, and the timeline is very common. It's part of actually the recommendations of the care guidelines for a case report. So everything that happened, as well as the different interventions. The interventions are there, so your methods, your outcomes, or your results, and then the conclusions, acknowledgements, and references, if any. So that's everything that I'm planning to cover today. I'm going to put in some links into the chat, and then I just want to mention, I'll take some questions here in a moment. The next webinar we have for this series is choosing a journal for publication, and that's coming up on February 27th. So I hope you all will be able to come. And if you have suggestions for future topics, please be sure to put it in the survey. So I'm going to go ahead and get those links, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions that there are. So those links that I just put in are for the survey, the next workshop. Oh, I forgot to change out the link, but I can fix that here. The web aim contrast checker, the Canva color wheel, and the data visualization catalog that I really liked. So I'll go back and look through some of the comments here. So someone shared 12% of men have a form of color blindness. And as I learned, women are not just carriers, but sometimes women do have it as well. Someone asked, what do I think about using small caps, where, and that's where your first letter is a big capital and then your other letters are small caps. I still think that that's a little hard to read, but I think it depends on where and how you're using it, because maybe if it's just like a subheading, that might still be readable. Should font size in tables match font size in the body of the text? That one I'd have to go and see if there's any recommendations on. I think that probably it should at least be the size of the body text so that it's readable, because usually the body text is the smallest out of all of them. But I could always look that one up for some more information. What is the data visualization catalog? And then someone shared that they looked it up, a great tool to select good graph options. Yes, so that again just lists a bunch of different graphs and then how they might be good and provides a brief overview of them. And thank you for sharing the link. Okay, so complementary colors, when to use those. So yeah, complementary, so they're at opposite sides of the color wheel. That's when you're trying to show that there's a difference in the data, that they are opposites. Okay, someone shared about the links for contrasting elements or information. Someone shared that they find using Microsoft Publisher easier to use than PowerPoint. Glad to hear that. Definitely another resource people can use. Someone asked if I think the modern poster design is going to become a new standard for research posters. I think it depends, because especially in medicine and health sciences, I think that there's definitely a trend to the more traditional way of doing things. And sometimes fields can be slow to change. But I think more people, maybe if more people are starting to advocate for the modern poster and more people start doing it, and as generations change, that it's possible that the modern poster will eventually just become more standard. Someone asked, if you don't have access to a graphics department at your institution, where would you recommend printing a poster? So just looking up different options for local places that do it. Some people I know have also printed it on a fabric. So then it doesn't wrinkle. It's a lot easier to take on an airplane if you're going somewhere or traveling that way. Printing your poster on multiple 8.5 by 11 pages, which are easier to print on your own. I mean, if that's your option that you have to do, absolutely go for it. But I do think if you can afford to have it printed, I think it just looks a lot better if you can. Yes, so someone shared that they have used and are a fan of the modern poster. The biggest pushback was from fellow teammates who had difficulty adjusting. Yep, that's one of those criticisms of it. Oh, and then someone shared, I meant the ones that were both green but were different shades of green. Okay, that's called monochromatic. So that's where they are part of that same uniform category. So like ages, that in that example, they were all ages, but they were just different. And they used like the darker green for the ones that had the most. If that doesn't answer your question, please feel free to add, and I'll be glad to go on further. Printed. Yeah, someone shared many poster presentations are in large conferences and you need to market, attract viewers and judges. And they also suggested a QR code for any handouts or papers for distribution. So these are all great questions and contributions. So you could certainly put a QR code on there if you want to. So I think I've gotten to everybody's questions or comments. Is there anything else? And you feel free to also unmute yourself if that's easier. So do I have any tips for online poster sessions? So do you mean if, yes, you're right, most of this does apply. If you're actually presenting it, that kind of thing, when talking over it, or like how does maybe the look and feel of it differ? Posters with no synchronous option, because I was like saying, for example, like the discussion section, generally you do that in person and live. So, and especially if there isn't a recording option, I mean, there might be a way to at least kind of integrate some of that. So just thinking about what would you want to share verbally versus, and maybe then, right, you do tweak your poster format to have more of the discussion in there. And I've seen some examples where there's both the discussion and the conclusion are in the same section. And then to follow up about the monochromatic, so use it for the same category, but to highlight things about the data in the category. Yes, so here, I can go back to that one and we'll take a look at that one. And someone did respond, different subsets of the data, for example, favorite sandwiches at different age groups. Let's see here. Let me go back and reshare my screen. Okay, actually I am still screen sharing, so that's good. A little box went away, so I couldn't tell. And then I made everybody a little dizzy probably going back. So, right, so this one is the age group, and then it has the different colors. So 30 to 44, 45 to 59. And also notice here, this is just a good tip. You want to make sure that there's no overlap here with your different categories. But right, these were all ages, but the two that they had in a darker green were the two with the most. So, okay. You are very welcome. I can stay on for another minute if anybody does have any additional questions. I hope to see you at our next webinar.